thanks, Professor Hansman, for joining us today at your office at MIT. Tell us a little about your work at MIT and the International Center for Air Transportation.
Well, the International Center for Air Transportation looks at a variety of things, both technical issues associated with air transportation and aviation safety, as well as sort of business and large-scale systems and operational issues. We also look at air traffic control problems.
That's nice. Now, in one of your recent papers titled "Analysis of Interaction Between Air Transportation and Economic Activity," you conclude that there's a correlation between air travel and GDP growth. How soon do you think airlines can come out of the current crisis, given it's going downhill?
Well, we know that that air transportation activity scales with or is related to GDP growth or economic strength. So, as economies grow, we see more air transportation. When we go into periods of recession, we see a pullback in air transportation. So, it's difficult to predict right now. Clearly, we're going into a period of sort of economic uncertainty and probably some recession. So we expect that there will be some pullback in air transportation activity. The airlines have already started to anticipate this.
Yep.
Both with concerns about fuel prices have, at least in the U.S. and in many other countries, pulled back some of their capacity. So we expect that the system will actually tighten up a little bit.
Right. How do you think airlines can minimize the impact of this crisis, the current crisis?
Well, it's difficult in a weak economic period. What you have to do is then sort of focus on places where you do add value to the system. So what people are doing are taking out some of the unprofitable routes, cutting back some of their frequency of service on some routes. So as you tighten up the supply, we actually expect that the yields will go up. And in fact, I think you'll see, in the next few months, it will actually be difficult to get a ticket on some routes.
Mm-hmm. Now, in your report, one of the things that you mention is that there are 3 phases of growth for an airline. There's the startup phase, there's the growth phase, and there's the saturation phase. Do you think these measures that you just mentioned would differ depending on which phase the industry is in?
Well, we see this as sort of in general behavior. We've actually looked at it by country.
Right.
And what you see is, historically there's been a relatively slow growth phase, and then often coupled with deregulation of the industry or liberalization of international agreements, you see a very strong growth phase. And then there's some indications, we actually don't see very many systems yet who have hit saturation, but we hypothesize that if you get to a point where the infrastructure can't expand anymore, you may then be in a point where it's actually difficult to grow anymore. We do see signs of this in places like New York, and some places in Europe.
Right. Now, the airlines, say one of your studies is about Emirates Airline and the UAE. The models there are so different from those in the US. Do you think those are more likely to succeed in the current crisis?
I think all airlines will be challenged, if we go into a global recession. I think that the airlines like Emirates are really competing on long-haul service, international service. So there are very few low-cost competitors that have come into the long-haul market, whereas in domestic markets or in the U.S. and in Europe, and now you're starting to see it in other parts of the world, there's competition from low-cost carrier startups. And in those cases, it's actually hard for the traditional carriers to compete in the sense that they have a larger cost basis. So they now have to match the low-cost carriers' pricing in order to be competitive. So it puts a lot of pressure.
Yep, that's right. Now, one of the main revenue sources for most long-haul airlines, as well as domestically U.S., is premium demand, which consists of business travelers, many of whom come from banks.
Sure.
Now that Wall Street has collapsed and a lot of banks are out of business, how do you think airlines can rejuvenate this premium demand and compensate for this?
Well, I mean, if you know how to do that, you're probably in good shape. I think that the reduction in premium demand or business travel demand is actually part of the reason why some of the domestic markets had trouble a few years ago. For example, again in the U.S., many companies restricted the use of business travel for domestic flying. That, coupled with the low-cost carriers, really pushed down the yields on domestic routes.
Right.
The international routes have basically been protected from that somewhat, so companies would still allow people to travel business class or premium class on international flights or flights longer than 10 hours. That will clearly soften somewhat, and so those airlines that are dependent on the premium passengers for their high yields in order to be profitable will be challenged, and we'll have to figure out how to try to deal with that.
Right. Now, a lot of domestic U.S. airlines have started imposing lots of fees on passengers, and this is certainly chasing passengers away. Do you think is there a better way to do this? Do you think that's wise?
Well, it's not clear that it's chasing passengers away. It's clearly irritating passengers.
Right.
But we don't actually see those small fees significantly reducing the demand.
Right.
Okay. And the airlines have really been struggling to try to find some way to compensate for the rising cost of fuel. So, what they found is these fees are actually profit centers. So, ultimately the passengers appear to be willing to pay for it. I personally prefer a simpler model, but a pay for what you get model, may be the way we go in the future.
Right. Now, given that currently airlines are so tightly tied with economic cycles, what do you think is a sustainable business model that actually decouples itself a little bit more from economic cycles?
Well, we know the industry is clearly cyclical, and it's related to the economic cycles. In the sense that demand comes from the economic cycles. However, there's another independent cycle, which is an airline-specific cycle. So we've seen that there's an approximate 10 or 11-year cycle in the industry in terms of its profitability, really related to how the industry matches demand, and it tends to overshoot and provides too much capacity. The prices go down. And then there's a compensation. And that cycle has historically been about 10 or 11 years. So you have this sort of natural cycle, capacity-demand cycle in the industry. On top of that, you have greater economic cycles which influence it. It's difficult for the industry to fully insulate itself from the external demand. What you need to do is find places where the demand will be solid, and also the industry will match its capacity, needs to match its capacity to the demand that's really out there.
Right. Now, one of the new business models that's emerging is just colluding. For example, American Airlines, British Airways are trying to tie up together. Air France, KLM are operating a lot together. Just yesterday in India, Kingfisher and Jet Airways announced a big tie-up.
Yeah.
Do you think this is a good way to counter this economic cycle?
Okay, well, I wouldn't call it colluding. I would. It's clear that we're seeing an integration in the industry, a sort of consolidation into a few mega carrier systems.
Right.
And this is actually driven in part by the U.S.-European Open Skies Agreement, which has allowed airlines to apply for airline alliances to apply for antitrust immunity and get more protection or allowance to synchronize their organizations. This is probably the first wave of getting real efficiencies out of airline alliances, and when that happens, it will be necessary in the large scale for other alliances to also integrate to get the sort of efficiencies of scale. So I think we'll see this trend for the next few years.
And what do you think will happen to the existing alliances like Star Alliance or OneWorld? Will they be mutually exclusive?
Well, I think that what will happen is that these alliances will will morph somewhat and will consolidate. And what you'll get is a core within those alliances of sort of synchronized operations where you have antitrust immunity. There will still be a periphery of looser alliances, which are basically just code sharing alliances. But I think you'll see it consolidate into a smaller set of sort of really strong alliances.
Right. And now, finally, what do you see in the future airlines need to do to be successful?
I think in the long haul, the challenges are going to be environmental and fuel efficiency. So I think that they will have to improve the efficiency of their operations, modernize their fleets, because there will be a significant pressure, particularly from greenhouse gas emissions. And this will be sort of strong social pressure. In addition, I think you will then see the airlines make the business side of their operations more efficient through some of these large-scale consolidations, but also making their business practices much more efficient in terms of electronic processing and distribution, which we already see today.
Right. Okay. Thanks a lot, Professor Hansman, for your views.
Sure.